It's 1997, and Steve Jobs is standing in front of a whiteboard at Apple headquarters. He looks out at a room full of engineers and executives and delivers a ruthless ultimatum. He is going to kill 70% of the products they've spent their lives building. It sounds reckless, but it was an act of pure desperation. Apple had hemorrhaged over $1 billion in the previous year. Internally, the finance department knew the grim reality. The company was exactly 90 days away from running completely out of cash. This chart shows how entirely Wall Street had given up on them. Apple's total market cap had withered to a mere $2 billion, while their chief rival, Microsoft, sat on a mountain of valuation worth $150 billion. The irony is that Apple's impending death did not stem from a lack of engineering talent or a shortage of ideas. They were suffocating from a catastrophic inability to focus. Over the previous decade, the company's catalog had exploded to 350 different products. That included 40 distinct lines of computers, many with nearly identical specs and baffling numbering schemes, designed specifically to trick consumers into not comparison shopping. Instead of refining their core lineup, they were pouring resources into vanity projects. They actually tried to sell this commemorative 20th anniversary Macintosh, asking consumers to part with $7,500 for a bizarre, underpowered machine. They were also dumping millions into side projects that strayed far from their core strengths, like the Pippin, a commercial failure of a gaming console that featured a highly unusual crescent-shaped controller. Carrying hundreds of products creates a massive hidden burden on an organization. This is the complexity tax. Every single variation requires its own manufacturing pipeline, a bloated HR department to hire staff, and endless customer support teams to manage the inevitable bugs. It silently drains cash. But the teams inside Apple couldn't see the bloat objectively. They had spent years pouring their blood, sweat, and tears into these devices. That deep emotional attachment created a massive sunk cost bias, making it impossible for insiders to make the objective cuts required to survive. To fix a mess this deep, Apple needed an intervention. 12 years earlier, Apple's board had pushed Steve Jobs out of his own company, but that exile ultimately served as a grueling, essential training period in corporate leadership. He went on to found a new computer company called Next. Building it was a painful, semi-public struggle that stripped away his early ego and forced him to learn the brutal mechanics of keeping a business alive. When Apple bought Next in 1996 to acquire its operating system, they brought Jobs back as an advisor. Because he had been gone for over a decade, he arrived with a distinct psychological advantage: outsider clarity. He looked at Apple's chaotic catalog and felt absolutely zero emotional attachment to any of it. Combining that cold detachment with a 90-day ticking clock bypassed the usual corporate politics. It gave him a crisis license to step up and execute radical changes immediately, without waiting for permission. Back in that room full of engineers, Jobs laid out a strict philosophy. You have to start with the customer's experience and work backward to the technology. You must completely ignore the engineering effort already spent. To enforce this rule, he stepped up to the whiteboard and drew a brutally simple analytical tool, a 2x2 matrix designed to dictate the entire future of the company. On one axis, he wrote consumer and pro. On the other axis, desktop and portable. The operational law of this framework was absolute. Apple was only going to fill those 4 specific squares. If an existing product did not fit perfectly into one of those quadrants, it was instantly dead. Enforcing this matrix came with an immense toll. Apple spent $100 million just to break contracts with third-party clone makers, and Jobs cut 3,000 jobs across the organization. This strategy meant executing highly publicized, beloved projects, like the Newton message pad. In a single announcement, dedicated development teams found themselves entirely out of a job overnight. Slashing 350 products down to just 10 looked like cruelty to the people who built them. In reality, it was a mathematical necessity. A business simply cannot survive if it tries to be everything to everyone. With the product line slashed, Jobs initiated the next phase of subtraction. In 1998, he hired a logistics expert named Tim Cook to apply that same ruthless cutting to Apple's physical supply chain. They operated on a shared philosophy: inventory is evil. They aggressively shifted Apple away from holding vast amounts of physical stock in warehouses where it tied up desperately needed cash. By concentrating all of Apple's consumer desktop engineering power into a single square of that matrix, they were able to deliver a highly focused, refined machine, the translucent iMac. That simplicity directly translated to scale. Because the lineup was clear and consumers were no longer confused by endless model numbers, Apple sold a staggering 800,000 units in just 5 months. The turnaround was immediate. Contrast that devastating billion-dollar deficit from 1997 with a casual announcement Jobs made at an event just a year later. The bleeding had stopped, and Apple was officially $45 million in profit. This chart shows the severity of that pivot. After plunging to negative $1 billion, their momentum snowballed. They hit nearly $400 million in profit for 1998, and by 1999, that number climbed to almost $600 million. Those brutal cuts made Apple financially viable again. The ubiquitous devices you carry today, the iPhone, the iPad, the AirPods, only exist because the company survived the 90s. True strategy is not a massive to-do list of what features to build next. It is the absolute courage to pick a direction and say no to everything else.